Hello, I'm Patrick Cronin, Asia-Pacific Security Chair, and on behalf of Hudson Institute, I want to welcome you to an in-depth conversation with U.S. Representative Rick Larsen, who has represented Washington State's 2nd Congressional District for more than 20 years now. And while we'll touch on everything from geography to politics, the focus of today's discussion is maintaining a free and open Indo-Pacific region. From free trade to the freedom of navigation, and from the preservation of national sovereignty to the adaptation of a liberal rules-based order, the challenges and the opportunities are immense as we look out across the Pacific Ocean. Russia may be closest, but it's China that looms over most discussions these days, including those about trade, technology, infrastructure, public health, homeland security, and defense. Representative Rick Larsen is co-chair of the Bipartisan U.S.-China Working Group, which helps educate members of Congress about all policies related to China. And not only is his district home to vital naval facilities, some 40% of all jobs in Washington state are tied to trade. And China, not surprisingly, is the largest and most rapidly growing export market for the state. Representative Larsen is a member of the House Armed Services Committee, the House Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure, and he's chairman of the Aviation Subcommittee. And he's also a member of the New Democrat Coalition and co-chair of its Trade Task Force. Congressman Rick Larsen's longevity in the House of Representatives is a testament to his ability to work well with his 750,000 or so constituents in the beautiful environment of America's Pacific Northwest. Congressman Larsen, welcome to the program.
Thanks so much, Patrick, and thanks for describing my district as beautiful as it truly is. I appreciate that. It's a great place to be from and a great place to represent.
Wonderful. I wonder if we could just start there for just a couple of minutes and just help us describe some of its economic and security, milestones and dimensions. I mean, what makes it special as a district? I know its natural wonders are fantastic around Puget Sound, but you also are home to some very important facilities and manufacturing bays.
Yeah, for the viewers and listeners, think of my district as north of Seattle and none of Seattle. Starts about 20 miles north of Seattle and goes up near the Canadian border. But I don't have the border, land border, but I have the water border. So the San Juan Islands and city of Everett and Mukilteo in the south, and San Juan in the north and Bellingham in the north. So it's kind of the dimensions. It's right along the Puget Sound. So the environment's important, and that environment attracts people, and with people come jobs, and jobs in the district are important in that we have the largest exporter in the country building airplanes. The large Boeing manufacturing facility is in South Everett in my district. And then on the military side, there's two major bases. Naval Station Everett, which the Navy just announced will be the first home port for the Constellation class frigates. The first two set to arrive in about 2025. And then Naval Air Station Whidbey Island in the north side, which is home to P-8 squadrons, the submarine hunters, as well as the E-18G Growlers. These are the electronic attack aircraft, and several other missions there as well. So between the environment, jobs, the national security contribution that the district makes, it provides a lot of opportunity to represent the people in the district.
It's fantastic. Yeah, the geography is stunning, and if people haven't studied it, they really ought to. I mean, I was looking at it closely yesterday. It's also a reminder, my father-in-law, we just buried my father-in-law at the Naval Academy this past week, and he died last year, Admiral Kurth, who had been our defense attaché to Moscow, but he flew patrol planes like the ones that flew out of Washington State back in World War II and the post-war during the Cold War. Indeed, we had an encounter with the Chinese from your home state. One of those, the only planes to go down in the LOC, right. I believe, was reportedly shot down potentially by the PRC. This was back in the early 1950s, which is a reminder how maybe we have gone full circle now because of the concern about potential for escalation with China. And I want to start really there with sort of thinking about the defense that we need to maintain a free and open Indo-Pacific, because I know you're so heavily trying to support our economic prosperity and trade, but we need to deter conflict. We need to make sure that China understands the rules of the road. And I'm wondering if you could just help us, Congressman, start off by how you think about flashpoints like Taiwan or the South China Sea or the Senkakus and the appropriate role for the United States to try to deter escalation of conflict, try to deter China's nibbling strategy, their gray zone strategy?
Yeah. It's a great question, and I might surprise folks with the beginning of my answer, because the answer is really a comprehensive answer, and it starts with our strength at home, making sure that we're taking care of our own selves and our own economy, making sure our economy is competitive. That's the investment that we're trying to make with the bipartisan transportation infrastructure bill. It's investing in long-term, investing in fifth generation or 5G technologies, other emerging technologies, and what we can do. For instance, on the Senate bill, I think the short-term name is, or the short name is USICA, the U.S. Innovation Competitive Act. That's being broken up in the U.S. House of Representatives, but we've passed portions of it, including the investment in National Science Foundation, in the Department of Energy on the research side. So we have to do some domestic things to be competitive, while as well thinking about what that show of strength economically can mean to the Indo-Pacific region, especially to our friends and allies, showing them that we're investing in our own strengths, but also supporting our role and our legitimate role in the Indo-Pacific. And that means investing on the national security side. And when you look at the work we're doing now in the defense bill with shipbuilding budget, investing in additional submarines, investing in the next Columbia class, I think that's important. But I would also note that thinking about competition, strategic competition with China means some cooperation as well on issues we need to cooperate. But in the defense realm, we need to be sure that we aren't thinking only about, as I jokingly say, things that we can kick and break our toe on. We have to invest in electronic warfare. We have to invest in cybersecurity, cyber defense, and cyber offense. These are these emerging technologies, and how we use them in national security is as important going into the future with regards to any national security competition with China as anything else. Secretary Austin has said China is our pacing challenge, and I agree with that. As much as I do engagement with the Chinese leadership, China is a pacing challenge on national security. And so these investments in, say, the hardware and the software are equally important looking into the future. And so, we can get into details about what that means, but strength at home means investing in our own economy so we can be competitive economically. And then working with our allies is critical to show strength with them, and making sure we're investing in the right things in our defense budget is also part of this broader comprehensive picture.
All of that is great. And you're right about the comprehensive approach. I mean, and I want to get into some of those other issues, everything from shipbuilding to our economy and our workforce. But just staying on this sort of pointy end of the concern about a Taiwan conflict. We've had, of course, the recent commander of the U.S. Indo-Pacific Command, Admiral Davidson, talk about the mid-20s being a window of danger. So when you think about sending ships, from Everett out to across the Pacific and into harm's way potentially, how do you think about deterring a potential conflict or the risk of a conflict over Taiwan?
Well, I think it's important that the United States continue to show with our friends, allies, and partners that we recognize waters around China that are international waters by conducting legitimate freedom of navigation operations. And I say that and do that with allies, our partners, and our friends in the region. We're doing that a lot in what some call the South China Sea, and we have done, I think, 21 transits in the last couple of years, if I'm not mistaken, through the Taiwan Straits. Just continually showing that the world, it's not just about showing China, it's showing the world what we consider international waters where it is legitimate to conduct freedom of navigation operations. And that signaling and messaging is extremely important when it comes to deterrence. And one of our former admirals out of Indo-Pacom, I think it was Pacom at the time, but Admiral retired Harry Harris used to talk about deterrence being in part about signaling to our friends and allies and partners that we recognize international waters and we will operate in those is critical. And that's, when it comes to Taiwan, we have the Taiwan Defense Act.
Relations Act.
Yeah, yes. The Taiwan Relations Act, where we have an obligation to provide defense materials over time. I don't think this administration is going to shy away from legitimate investment in that as well. And we know this upsets the Chinese government, but we're not doing it to upset anyone as much as we're doing it to ensure that we're showing our friends and allies and partners that we won't back down from being in the region.
I think you're highlighting the importance of getting the balance right of, and quoting Admiral Harry Harris about sort of showing deterrence, doing enough, but not doing so much that you provoke and escalate. You know this so well from Washington State, where you're trying to have trade and prosperity and an economy, and yet you're trying to play a leading defense role in keeping the peace and keeping a rules-based order. A couple of questions related to that, one of them is in cyberspace that we've just seen in the news, of course, where the United States and allies have called out China for the Ministry of State Security, which is no longer a secret organization. It's well known around the world for leading.
They were never a secret following me around when I'm in China.
No. But at the same time, six years ago, I believe it was, Xi Jinping, with great fanfare, visited Boeing and visited Washington State. He landed in Seattle, and there were happier days, seemingly. But Xi Jinping has really hardened the nationalism that you've noted before in the wolf warrior diplomacy in the sort of this 100th centennial celebration this past month. So do you feel like we can get China as a partner to agree to a liberal rules-based order that allows freedom of navigation and allows cyber norms that don't escalate and lead to economic espionage, for instance?
I think some of your viewers and listeners and anyone will probably disagree with me somewhat on this, but I do think there are areas where the U.S. and China can cooperate for our own interests. And in my experience, what I have always tried to communicate to Chinese interlocutors is my view of what their interests are, as opposed to my view of what my or the U.S. interests are. Because I don't think the Chinese Communist Party or the government is going to act in our interest. They're going to act in their interest. And it is in, for instance, on cyber warfare, cyber attacks, it is definitely in their interest. As the government there invests more in cyber operations, invest more in a 5G economy and then a next G economy as well, it is definitely in their interest to play a security of network game for themselves. They will not, this recent announcement just in the last day, or even NATO was included in this announcement of naming and shaming the Chinese government and specifically the Ministry of State Security for these cyber attacks. I think it's sending a very clear signal to the Chinese government that the days of hiding behind hackers are going to be over, and there also is an interest in their interest as well as ours and the rest of the world to develop norms around cyber operations. Obviously, there are probably certainly people much more knowledgeable on what exactly those norms ought to be, but transparency is certainly one. Espionage and how we handle espionage is certainly another. But I think that, again, the days of the Chinese government and the Communist Party hiding behind hackers are over, as much as the days of the United States saying nothing about cyber attacks are over. Those days are over as well.
Yeah, the stunning thing about this collective condemnation of China's actions over the Microsoft exchange is that they're saying the Ministry of State Security reached out, outsourced to contractors, criminal contractors, to for intellectual property theft, for economic gain for China's national champions. And that's been a red line for some time, going back to the Obama administration, where there was presumably an agreement that broke down and then we've tried to cobble it back together. So the question is, how do we put that collective pressure? And you're right, you've got the European Union, you've got the Five Eyes countries and others actually calling out China by name in an unprecedented sort of statement. And yet it's only words still at this point, as some cyber analysts have pointed out. On Russia, for instance, we've taken more sanctions than we have against China to some extent. So the question is, where do we go next? Yes,
can
please.
I step in? Yeah, it is only words, except when you look at what China wants to, the Chinese government wants to do, and the sandboxes they want to play in, right? They're openly talking about trying to get into the CPTPP. They the Chinese government has a very aggressive approach to standard setting bodies around the world and technology. There are sandboxes that the Chinese government are deliberately trying to play in that now become much more difficult for them to play in as we are calling out their actions. So yeah, if we're only looking at the sanctions, yeah, okay, fair criticism, but that's not the only play at play here. And when you've got all these other countries working together, and organizations working together, these are the same organizations working together at these standard setting bodies. These are the same countries that are involved in the CPTPP conversations, who are now have another lever to push back on Chinese economic policy because of what happened over the last couple of days, because of the announcement over the last couple of days. So, for all the focus on the criticism on no, we sanction Russia and not too well, but we're not doing anything to China. It's been a day, folks, since this announcement. So give it a couple more. Give it a
Absolutely.
couple more.
And I wasn't criticizing Congressman Larsen as much as trying to project,
No.
Where might we be going with this? And that's,
yeah, right.
I think one of the issues in the region, in the Indo-Pacific, they want to know where the Biden administration, during the Biden administration, will go with China policy. Is there a floor under this relationship? How much stability do we really have with China? Because they don't want they want our defense, but they don't want us to start a war. And they want to know if our economic policy is going to allow for their trade to go forward, or whether we're going to be disrupting supply chains. So how do we thread the needle on this sort of economic relationship with this behemoth, China, and at the same time protect our security?
Yeah, it's a really great question, Patrick, because of this, the view that the U.S.-China relationship is strictly a bilateral one, because it is not. First off, the relationships that the U.S. has with China are multiple. So it's not one relationship, it is a set of relationships. And then on top of that, countries in the region who both want the U.S. in the region for all sorts of things, diplomacy, national security, economic trade, but the same message, and they're vocal about this, same message, the same folks giving the message, don't make us choose, right? Don't make us choose between being the U.S. is being only a friend of the U.S. or only a friend of China, because they don't want to choose. And frankly, in fairness, it's probably in our interest not to make folks choose, because right now, my own assessment is they tend to be more choosing us than them. But there's a study out of RAND, and I don't know if it's appropriate to cite some of your competitors
Sure.
here, but RAND did a study. It was an Air Force request last year, 2020, and the Air Force said, could you assess some categories of relationships between different countries in the Indo-Pacific relative to the U.S. and relative to China, and then grade those? And that's essentially what they did. They came up with 14 different, I'll be quick about this, 14 different categories. And the economic categories, categories, these countries like Singapore, like a little bit of Japan, a little bit of Korea, tended to be dominated more by a China relationship. But in the diplomacy and national security categories, it tended to be dominated by a U.S. and country set of relationships. It's important to note that because it shows the gaps in where we have to, I think the United States has to pick up our game relative to China, relative to these countries in the region. This includes Australia, New Zealand, includes Japan, includes Korea, Singapore, and some of the even smaller countries in the region as well, Vietnam as a for instance. So it was a good rubric to think about how to address that question you have, how to reset that balance a little bit relative country to country to improve our really good standing, but to improve upon that relative to the relationships that they have with the Chinese mainland.
Well, just to reinforce the point you've made, you said earlier that China has to play with others and it's worried about missing out on opportunities, whether it's the comprehensive and progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership potentially, or whether it's in setting international standards. The recent Pew poll showing that most advanced economies around the world have lost a lot of trust in China and have gained a lot more trust in the United States. But we still have this sort of missing economic trade dimension to our policy that's been lagging and sort of falling behind, partly because we fell out with trying to join the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and partly because just China's become a growing economy and so fast that it's become the #1 trade partner for most countries. How do you think about the possibility of getting back into trade? We've talked about this years ago, and you made it very clear to me at the time that your constituents were very skeptical about multilateral trade agreements, and that's proven to be true nationally.
Yeah. As pro-trade as my state is.
Yes, and yet you've got U.S. Trade Representative Tai, for instance, talking about trying to put together a multilateral digital trade pact because we have bilateral trade agreements on the digital economy with Japan and Singapore and others in Australia. Can we somehow knit together a path back toward multilateral trade in the Pacific?
I think that it won't be a broad-based TPP-like approach. I think it's going to be sectoral and maybe what's the term, plurilateral.
Yes.
More than 2, less than 1 million countries kind of trade agreements, and there's a lot of discussion in Washington D.C. among embassies here and Congress about a digital trade accord based upon elements of the USMCA and elements of bilateral trade agreements between countries in the Indo-Pacific as well. If you start pulling out those sections of those different agreements and accords and piling them on top of each other, they begin to align relatively well, and you're arguing about 20% instead of 100% of something, and you've got a fair number of countries that could want to be part of that, and those discussions are taking place. And I think that when I think about outside groups, Asia, Wendy Cutler at Asia Society, former deputy USTR, has talked about this digital trade accord. Others have as well. That seems to be where more of the momentum is, as opposed to jumping into CPTPP or creating something else out of whole cloth. I would note that the Biden administration and USTR Tai has said this as well, is that the foundation of any of that, though, is still making sure we have our strengths in order at home. It's a policy of being competitive as opposed to a trade policy. And you see that playing out every day in the newspapers, digital or actual paper, about this bipartisan effort on transportation, as a for instance.
Well, let's talk a little bit about what investments we do need to make here at home, and how can we make a difference? I mean, and can we get it across the finishing line in your business there in Congress? Can we get enough bipartisan support to pass what we need to do? What do we need to do, first of all, in terms of infrastructure and investment at home, do you think?
Yeah, Secretary Buttigieg likes to point out that the United States is 13th in infrastructure investment of countries in the world. We ought to be higher. We know investment in infrastructure not just creates jobs in putting the infrastructure in the ground, but it also makes our economy more efficient. We can deal with bottlenecks, physical bottlenecks in our economy. We do that. But infrastructure is a little broader than roads, bridges, highways, transit, rail. It's also broadband, and discussion about broadband being part of infrastructure is a pretty critical piece as well. And I think one of the lessons from the pandemic here in the U.S. has been the digital divide in our school districts, a digital divide between urban, suburban, rural, digital divide within urban areas. And no one disagrees with the premise that affordable access to the internet is really part of what it will take to ensure the current next generation remains competitive. And so that's why broadband ought to be part of this infrastructure discussion. But I would, over the last couple of days, I was, I'm in DC right now, but last week I was home, and I get a lot of questions when I'm home. It's like, well, what are the odds of the transportation infrastructure package passing? And I always say the odds are better the more you work, right? Because you don't put odds on this. There will be 19 darkest before the dawn moments still as we move through this process. This bill will die more than zombies in The Walking Dead before it lives to be signed by the president, because that's the legislative process. We have to keep pushing forward on this, but there's a lot of goodness in this infrastructure bill. It's part of our competitiveness. There's a tripling of Amtrak funding. There's a major investment in transit. There's continues to be a major investment in the roads, bridges, highways portion of this legislation. So, we still have some ways to go, and I'm still confident that we'll get it done. I can't tell you how it'll get done. When it's done, I'll be 100% right in how it got done. Before then, I'll be 100% wrong in telling you how it's going to get done. So.
Well, thank you for your persistence on that. I mean, it does seem there's inherently bipartisan support for infrastructure, but getting what that is and how do you get it done has been the sort of perplexing challenge. The 5G is an important issue in and of itself because it does speak to the high technological competition with China. Yeah. And I wonder if I can sort of segue from there to a question about our technological competitiveness with China. Not just in 5G, but as you think about artificial intelligence and quantum and other areas, you start to get to potential industrial policy, which is sort of a bad name in sort of politics. So forgive me for intellectually thinking of terms that are not sellable to a public. Right. But intellectually, the government has some role to set incentives to be a catalyst in areas where there might not be enough sort of immediate private sector support. Or conversely, how do we protect our private sector in big tech without just dismantling it? We want to regulate it to some extent, but at the same time, we don't want to lack national champions to compete with China's national champions. So what is our approach to technological competitiveness? Yeah,
it's complex. I think more complex than folks realize. Right now, we did pass as part of the NDAA defense bill last December, the CHIPS Act, which is a major investment in semiconductor chips, something that is relatively unusual for us, for the United States to do. And now we're hoping to fund that as well. And this would basically help expand the US-based market for chip production by creating fabs or fabrication facilities, which are expensive to do, take time to put together, and take time, therefore, to produce the chips. But there is a legitimate concern in the United States about reliance on a few chip manufacturers around the world that are, again, non-US based. Some of those are one large one in Taiwan, so one in the Netherlands as well. We've got a homegrown one here in the United States, but there's we've seen a chip shortage from the pandemic. A shift in production, a shift in use, where the chips are going, resulting in shortages for other uses. So there's a good national security and economic security reason for this. I would also note that on 5G, we're There are 12 different pilot projects within the Department of Defense taking place about how to apply, how to use 5G technologies. And there is the continued investment within DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, in what next G looks like, whether that's 6G or whatever number it jumps past to get to, but what the next generation of communications looks like as well. And so we are investing in some of that, and it shouldn't be a surprise. We've been investing, DARPA, for instance, have been, 40 years experience in artificial intelligence investment. And so we look at some of these things today and say, well, the private sector needs to do that. Well, the private sector didn't start it in the first place. The public sector investment started some of these investments and expanded into the private sector, which is how we do it, and that's our model. I think, though, in the last several years, vis-a-vis China, we've seen the necessity of ensuring a tighter supply chain because of security concerns. You can't have 5G communications that are easily hacked. And not to say that the big three private sector providers in the United States are just approaching this willy-nilly without any security in mind, but the security the Department of Defense needs is very different, much higher standard than the security that an average person might need for their 5G communications. And so there's a little bit of a conflict going on right now in how we approach 5G in the Department of Defense. Not that we shouldn't use it, we do need to use it, but how we can ensure security if we're going to be using private sector providers. And so, they're part of this conversation as well. And we're having this conversation in one of the subcommittees I serve on, the Armed Services Committee, trying to move this thing along as quickly as possible to stay ahead of competitors, but as well to thinking about the next generation of communication infrastructure and software.
And all of these investments that have to be made at home, as vital as they are, we still need to work with others, as you know. And I know with Japan, we've talked about an open radio access network, ORAN, as one workaround on the 5G to kind of a software fix to the hardware problem, if you will. We're working with the quadrilateral security countries of India, Japan, Australia. We're working with other allies, obviously, across the Atlantic as well as the Pacific. And I'm wondering whether you feel like there's enough common ground to build trusted supply net chains, to get enough political will to stand up, as they have stood up recently over the cyber issue, to make a difference given China's sort of challenge to the rules and challenge to order.
I think there is enough. It's not going to happen automatically. But I think that this fall, if I'm not mistaken, in September, the president is hosting a Quad meeting in person. Be a little easier to have the discussions in person than on Zoom, as I did earlier, like we're having, but in person to talk about what the Quad can do to work together and drive a broader national security agenda that is technology based and also based on a persistent presence in the region as well. But is it on the technology side that we still have to, I think there's agreement certainly on principles, openness, transparency, as a for instance, but the details will matter, and the discussion of details will matter among these countries, because the Quad is only 4 countries, four important ones. Don't want to take that away from any of them, but there are other countries that will want to be involved in some of these discussions around technology standards as well. And the U.S. is, I think, being more aggressive about participating in these standard-setting bodies than we have in the past, recognizing that there are a lot of players who are able to bring science to bear and bring their interest to bear as well, these standard-setting bodies. So I would presume that technology standards will be part of this discussion at the Quad, along with a host of other issues.
Indeed. At the March quadrilateral virtual leaders meeting that President Biden hosted online, if you can host online, they agreed on.
Somebody has to run the technology behind the curtain.
Indeed, but there were 4 boxes up there with 4 leaders, and they agreed to some remarkable things. Really, one of them was to create 1 billion vaccine doses to vaccinate all of Southeast Asia within 12 months. And it seems to me that's delivering on that promise is going to be very important in the next 9 months. But they also agreed on trying to work together on supply chain security and on high technology, and that's going to be very important. And they came together on the margins of the G7 meeting in Cornwall earlier this year as well, where they added South Africa and South Korea as well as Australia. So this sort of democracy club, if you will, trying to come together and set international standards. There are other critical countries that are not so democratic, like Vietnam, others in Southeast Asia where democracy is sort of on the run to some extent, even in our ally, the Philippines. It's been challenging times under President Duterte. And it's Southeast Asia in particular where we seem to need to improve our engagement. And I know Defense Secretary Austin is heading out there to Singapore, Philippines, and Vietnam this next week. When you think about how to improve our engagement with Southeast Asia, are there any things that you're recommending or trying to support that we can do better?
Well, it's first and foremost, showing up is critical in that region for the United States. I've often said that this old, and it's a very old term, I don't hear it a lot, I hear it once in a while, but people talk about Asia as the Far East. And that's really an East Coast bias, if you will. And we hate East Coast bias from the West Coast because there's the East to Europe and then there's the Far East. Where I'm from, it's the near West. Yeah. It's across the water. I don't have to go to Europe to get to Asia. I just go to Asia. And I think that we need to have kind of that attitude more about our relationship in the Indo-Pacific. We are a Pacific nation. We need to act like it, and that means presence. And so Secretary, in part, means presence. So Secretary Austin's trip, he's not to Japan and not to South Korea, but to Vietnam, Philippines, and Singapore, smaller countries, important countries for the United States. Is it a critical, signal? It's a signal to our friends and allies, and it's a signal to the Chinese government and the Chinese Communist Party as well. Certainly Duterte is he's acted horribly. The Vietnam is run by the Vietnamese Communist Party. Singapore is it has elections. It's a good friend of ours and it hosts our Navy and is a great help in many ways, in a lot of ways, and a great trade partner as well. So this is a great, a great opportunity for the United States to show its presence vis-a-vis the entire regions, but certainly vis-a-vis China.
Indeed, one of the challenges of showing up has been COVID. Trying to manage this during a pandemic has been so difficult. And ordinarily, Secretary Austin would have already been in Southeast Asia during the annual Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore that takes place at the end of May, beginning of June. That was canceled because of COVID. It's good that he's going out there now, but it has certainly hampered the sort of exchange. I wonder if you just in general, Congressman Larsen, how COVID has affected your district, Washington State, the West Coast, and how you're looking ahead. I mean, we're concerned right now about a possible resurgence, even with the vaccination rate being fairly high in the U.S.
Yeah, vaccinations are rate in our states about, I think 70. It's over 70%, at least one vaccine, and it's pretty high for the 2 doses as well. We were hit pretty hard. To give you some proxy numbers about the economy, our state Department of Transportation, they have cameras along Interstate 5, and there are 2 cameras on I-5 within my home county of Snohomish County. And based on the numbers they tracked from March 1st of 2019, by the end of that month, the traffic was down 90%, 90%. We have the largest ferry system in the country measured by vehicles travel and people traveled. Again, you saw this precipitous drop of travel as a proxy of the economy. If people aren't moving, the economy is not moving. Literally, if people are not moving, the economy is not moving, and the economy was not moving. We've seen a great bounce back in our state, the economy. Still seeing the hospitality industry hurt. There's still folks who, I think we've lost people returning to the workforce who aren't coming back because they might have been near retirement and they figured we're close enough, we're not going back into the workforce. We have a huge childcare issue that really screamed at us during the pandemic. And so, there's a group of parents who aren't ready to go back into the physical workplace until there's a childcare remedy or until schools open in the fall, and schools will be open in the fall. So there's a lot of factors at play, but the economy is emerging, but not yet emerged. And the pandemic is being defeated, but not yet defeated. And I think that story is true throughout the country, but we've been pretty aggressive. One particular issue in Washington State, along with all the other states really along the border with Canada, is the opening of the Canadian border, which plays an important part in our economy. Canada is actually our number one trading partner with so much traffic going back and forth. Third busiest border crossing in the country at the Blaine border crossing on I-5. It'll never be second or first. That's Detroit, Windsor, and Buffalo, Niagara, but very busy on the West Coast. And the Canadian government announced August 9th is that they'll allow U.S. citizens, vaccinated U.S. citizens and permanent residents into Canada. But we haven't heard an announcement out of the United States yet if there's a reciprocal. So that's important too, to have people from Canada coming to the United States for our economy. So that, again, things are getting there. They're not there yet. And I track air travel as well as the chair of the subcommittee on aviation, and air travel is coming back for leisure, not so much for business. And then of course is the open question about international travel into Asia, into Central and South America, and into Europe. And so we're still working through some of those issues as well. So still some work to do, but we're getting there. But we've had too many people die in our state from COVID as well. Some of those, it seems all unnecessary, but we've had the pains and agonies of COVID hit us as well.
I wonder if I'd just ask you about the future of aviation from your perspective. I mean, in addition to COVID coming out of it, there was also growing competition with countries like China. The recent Airbus Boeing deal was a good thing, but where are we poised now in the 2020s to be in terms of as an aviation sort of nation?
Yeah, just quickly on the Boeing Airbus deal, it's a pause for 5 years. Finally, we can stop yelling at each other for a while, but we can't waste those 5 years. It's important, given the advancement of China's aviation sector, that we establish the rules around what is an appropriate type of subsidy and level of subsidy. And that was the whole Boeing Airbus debate. And without some WTO direction and agreement, then it's going to be very difficult to prevent, even the COMAC, the Chinese state-owned enterprise that manufactures airplanes, to get them to get it to play by any set of rules. So we have to use this pause between the U.S. and EU on airplane subsidies to help craft a global solution. But further, before the pandemic, I was at the Future of Aviation's bright. It is still bright. It's a different kind of bright, I think. Again, we saw the answer to the questions about international travel, but aerospace is really, I've been in Congress 20 years, and we're as much as we're talking about airplanes, we're also now talking about new entrants in the airspace. We saw Branson's flight last week. I think Bezos is flying today as we record this as well. So commercial space flight is, forgive me, taking off. Sorry about that. I apologize to everybody for that term. But commercial space, you're seeing air taxis. You know, the age of the Jetsons is actually pretty close to becoming a reality in our country, where you see what we call advanced air mobility, these electric vehicle, electric takeoff and lift, eVTOL, for domestic use and regional travel. We're seeing electric propulsion being developed for airplanes to retrofit smaller airplanes, and eventually larger airplanes, maybe 50 to 75 people, 50 to 75 seaters, and electric propulsion airplanes to do these 500-mile, regional trips. There is a lot of technology and a lot of reality to that technology that makes aviation and aerospace here in the United States very exciting. It's hard to look past the problem that we are in right now. The pandemic still holding us back, but there's a lot of other things going on, including drone and the use of drones for a lot of, not just package delivery, but infrastructure inspection and insurance for insurance needs and natural disaster needs. So it's a very exciting time in aviation, in my view, and thinking about kind of an airplanes and approach. It's not just airplanes; it's a lot of other things that make aviation and aerospace exciting here in the United States.
Well, you've hit upon a lot of positive themes. America has the potential to invest anew in itself. We're competitive. We have allies and partners. There's technology coming online that we can sort of harness. And yet our politics nationally have seldom been as divisive. I mean, they have been divisive throughout our history, let's face it.
No question.
Read history, see the play Hamilton, whatever. But I mean, there's no doubt it goes back to our roots, but still things have been worse in recent decades. And how do you see a way out of this sort of gridlock or the dysfunction even that some people see about our country?
Yeah. I think I want folks to know that there are plenty of bipartisan opportunities in Congress. I'm a co-chair of the bus caucus with a Republican, and we focus on transit and funding for transit agencies and trying to expand that funding and to kind of promote and proselytize about the value of transit in our urban and suburban and even rural areas. And I have rural areas in my district that benefit from transit. So there's that. The U.S.-China Working Group is a bipartisan group as well. There are any number of bipartisan-based, in fact, required to be bipartisan-based caucuses throughout Congress, and a lot of work being done. That does get lost in the headlines of the day, and I fully appreciate that. To get some of the big stuff done in a bipartisan way is very difficult, but we are constantly exercising our bipartisan muscles, if you will, on small things in hopes that we can build up big things. Even where we disagree, we had disagreements on the Transportation Committee about our transportation bill. I can't think of anyone on that committee on the Republican side of the aisle, and I'm not going to suggest that they would say the same about our side. I won't speak for them, but I can't think of a Republican in my transportation committee that I couldn't get along with and don't get along with. And we differ. We differ on things. That happens. But I want to assure folks that there is a lot of bipartisanship going on. But on the big things, that move the country one way or the other, it does get, the bigger the stakes, the bigger the tougher it is to get things to move. And I don't doubt that. But you have to work on it. If you don't work through that, it's time to, hang up the cleats, as they say in soccer. So.
Well, and you, I think, won your 11th term last November. So that's a real testament again to your fortitude and your success. I don't know what the secret is, but I mean,
more fortitude than success.
but I mean, China and your closest neighbor, Russia, put forward much less democratic models, and they hide and conceal the dirty politics that are going on sort of underneath that. And it may look rosy from an autocratic projection and propaganda lens. Why should we be optimistic that our American democratic project will continue to succeed in this 21st century and beyond?
Well, I mean, to take the negative argument, the best thing autocrats are good at is suppressing democracy. That's what they do best. They can talk about all their successes, and there have been successes in some autocracies. I don't want to downplay billions of people or millions of people being pulled out of poverty as a for instance. But when you oppress people along the way, that's not a success. We've been able to do that in our democracy. We've also been able to confront our faults in our democracy. We can do that, and we need to, sometimes we have this debate about whether we should confront our faults because are you downplaying America? One of our greatest strengths is that we are always trying to form a more perfect union. It says so. The founders actually got a lot of things right. They got some things wrong when they wrote the Constitution, but they got a lot of things right, that we need to form a more perfect union, not a perfect one. They never assumed we'd be perfect. That's how I read it. And so I think the strength of our democratic republic is the resiliency in challenging ourselves. And if we forget that, that's our downfall. And I think right now in that context, we are challenging ourselves right now, and it's difficult. I'm a pro low hurdles to voting, high penalties for voter fraud person. Not everybody is, but in Washington State, we've proven that you can do vote by mail, and you can penalize people heavily if they engage in voter fraud, and that word gets around pretty quickly. And that's, this voting rights debate is a little bit about what are the right standards for voting in a democratic republic like ours. And we see some states doing things differently than they do in Washington State. And I wouldn't do that in some of those states. I think getting in the way of people voting who are legally registered to vote is not a right approach. I don't think it's a winning approach for a country. But again, in our democracy, we have that debate, and we shouldn't shy away from the debate. And we shouldn't assume people are looking at the debate and seeing, see, there goes America again. They can't even get their democracy right. Our debate is actually about getting democracy right, and getting democracy right is about debating these things. They don't do that. It doesn't happen in all these countries who are our main critics, and that's fine. If they don't want it, I don't want it for us, and I don't want it for them. And I will speak out against what these countries are doing as well to oppress democracy, movements to oppress human rights. We have to do that as well, because that's what, it's in our nature in the United States. That's what we do.
Your free give and take today is testament to that. You are clearly on the front lines of maintaining a free and open Indo-Pacific. Thank you for your service, Congressman Larsen. Godspeed, and we hope we'll see you again soon.
Thank you, Patrick. I appreciate it very much.